Welcome to Ozcast, the platform where we take a deep dive into the science and research behind the issues impacting Australian waterways. Each week, we team up with experts in their field to take a look below the surface. Well, g'day and welcome back to Ozcast. On this episode, I team up with Lee Baumgartner to look at a very interesting yet slightly controversial topic of fish kills. In 2018 and again in 2022, we had millions of fish float up dead in the Murray-Darling Basin, particularly at Menindee in the Darling River. And there's been a lot of question posed since. So today, I sit down with Lee to ask not just what happened and what went wrong, but what we can do into the future to ensure these fish kills don't happen again. It's a really interesting conversation. Lee offers some really great anecdotes and insights into his career working in this field. So sit back and relax and join us for another episode of Ozcast as we take a look beneath the surface. Lee, welcome to Ozcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on. I mean, we've done coming to the end of season 1 on this platform now, and I must admit this might be one of the more highly anticipated episodes. You know, I'm not going to say for any good reason, because the issue we're about to talk about is, you know, quite sensitive and controversial at times, and but I still think there's a lot of misunderstanding around the issue of fish kills in Australia. And what we like to do on this platform is address and sometimes debunk some of the science and research behind that. So that's what we're going to do today. But before we do so, anyone who's going to sit down and have a listen, I really like to give them a bit of an overview of who they're going to hear from, because if you're going to take if you're going to take knowledge and science and research away from a platform like this, then you want to know you're doing it from a credible source. Now, I have no qualms about how credible you're about to be, because you're wearing about 50 different hats in the industry. Can you give us a bit of an overview, I guess, of why your name was thrown up when it came to, I want to do an episode on fish kills? How you got there? What have you done to be considered the leading name, or one of? I'm not going to give. I don't want to flutter you, but one of the leading names in looking at fish kills here in Australia.
Well, I guess it's a bit of a sad story in the end, in that look, I've been a fisherman my whole life, right? And I got into fish. I think Dad's got a photo of me when I was 2, and I had a little fishing rod, and it didn't even have a reel on it. It was just a bit of line on the end and a hook, and I caught a redfin. And I felt it wiggle, and I walked backwards and dragged it up the bank. That was how I got into fish. But all I've ever wanted to do was just work on fish. I've never known anything any different. And so I've probably someone who was a fisherman who then a bit of a science tragic my whole life, who ended up with a job doing what I love. So it was good from that perspective. But in terms of the fish kill stuff, I guess I've been now on two pretty major panels which have investigated the fish kills. Initially, I worked for government for a long period of time before I jumped over to university, and that being in university now lets me be a little bit independent of government and talk about things in that way. So I've been pulled in as the independent, and it's not a particularly pleasant thing to do, to investigate a fish kill. That's why I say it's a bit sad. It's a pretty confronting thing. When
you say panel or investigate, is it, to find an analogy, is it like, on a royal commission into an event, for example? Is it that type of thing where something's gone wrong, for example, the fish kill, and the only response to something like that is to basically put a team of people on it and come up with an answer, or try come up with an answer? Is it that simple? Is that what the panel is that you're referring to?
It's pretty easy to say, right, a bunch of fish died in a river. Let's get some fish people together and find out what happened. But very rarely is it just an answer about fish. And we always say this in fish kills all the time. Fish are the canary in the coal mine. So fish dying en masse is something that's not normal. And it's something that happens because a whole bunch of other things have gone wrong. And so when you talk about these panels, you've got people on panels who are hydrologists, you've got people on panels who are algal experts, you've got water quality experts, you've got me as the token fish person, but surrounded by people with all these complementary skills just to try and understand what happened.
Yep. And you've been on 2 of them now. So for someone listening to this, they can confidently say that, I think you're going to, is it 2018 and 2023 or 2022? Yeah. They're the 2 that you've been on?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I hope we're going to dive into some pretty complex issues, I hope, but we're going to try to flesh them out, so someone at home who likes to just chase Murray cod or golden perch in some of these rivers can, when next time they're out, they might be able to see 1 or 2 things and go, that's what Lee was talking about, So just on fish kills, do we have a definition? And I don't expect you to know this, but do we have a definition of what a fish kill is? So, for example, I live in Lake Macquarie. I fit my local waterways, Lake Macquarie, and last year, August last year, we had a fish kill, and the media labelled it as a fish kill. We have hot water outlets in at the lake. They were shutting down, and one afternoon, there was a couple hundred fish on a southerly wind, kind of blew into this southern bank or southern facing bank, and the media jumped onto it and labelled it a Lake Macquarie fish kill. And by definition, fish died. Fish were killed. So, but it was probably 80 metres, 100 metres of bank, and there might have been 100 fish. I went down and had a look at it, and they were predominantly bottom dwelling, bream, flathead, herring, mullet. But then, looking at images in and around Menindee in 18 and 22, we're talking kilometres of dead fish. So in your time, when people talk of fish kill, can you have is 3 fish dying because of a certain thing a fish kill? Do you get what I'm playing at there?
Yeah. Look, there's a few definitions tossed around, but 100 tends to be the magical number.
Right.
So if you've got more than 100 fish dying in an area, in a reach or whatever at the same time, and it's not normal, then that tends to raise red flags. But usually if someone's saying, I think we've got a fish kill, or there's a few dead fish, this isn't right, you'd investigate anything because you don't know whether even a small kill is a symptom of something that could be bigger. Yeah,
it comes back to the canary in the coal mine thing where you're going, right, well, if 100 have died today or 50, that's probably an indication that something much bigger is going to happen.
Absolutely.
Right. So in looking at the timeline of Australia, I can only assume that we haven't only had 2, and I guess to start it off, I think it's one of the really interesting things I've learned on this platform is that like floods and drought, for example, are natural occurring events. And one thing that is probably not common knowledge that a healthy system is one that, if you look at a line, for example, a graph, it floods and then it droughts and it floods and then it droughts. But over the period of 100 years, it evens itself out, right? So would you say at some level a fish kill is a normal event when the system's in its natural state?
We had a really interesting discussion about this on the most recent panel. And I'll answer this by getting out of the basin for a little bit.
Right.
Now, if you think about, most people talk, if you think about fish migrations, the first thing that pops into people's heads is salmon, right? Salmon flying up rivers. And
Australian salmon you're talking about?
North American salmon, the tasty ones.
Yeah.
And so when you they do their annual spawning migration, they go up the river. They've lived in the ocean for several years. And they go up the river to spawn, and after they spawn, they die. Right? So they charge up the river, use everything in the tank. The last thing they do is drop their eggs or their milk, and then they're dead. And that happens. There's thousands, like tens of thousands of salmon die every year, but that's completely normal, right? Everyone knows that's normal. That's part of their ecology. Right? The First Nations people in North America talk about the salmon kills every year, and then those dead salmon are actually, if you think about it, they're just chunks of carbon that go charging up the river. And so they seed all this productivity. And so every year the salmon go up there, they decompose, the food for the baby salmon comes out of the dead adults and everything, so it contributes part of the ecosystem. So that's normal. You can say that's a normal fish kill because we know it happens. There isn't, and we had a big chat in this current panel with the First Nations people. There's no historical storyline or narrative or ancient stories that say every year big chunks of native fish died in the river. And so, yes, floods are natural and droughts are natural, but there's no 65,000 years of history which says this happened all the time.
And a common one would maybe be like a mitten, for example, like a bunch of skeletons of fish. We commonly find them around and go, that must have been a feeding site for our, First Nations peoples, but there's nothing to say that happened.
Well, they were caught and eaten because that was your source of protein. So what the fish kills we are seeing these days are completely related to the way we manage our rivers. This is all, and the number one finding from this most recent panel was we are responsible for this. We are 100% responsible for this. And the way that the system used to bounce back from floods and droughts is so different now because the rivers are so modified.
Right. So just on that point, for people that want us to expand on it, floods and droughts are natural.
Yep.
But we've made them, and by talking maybe in the last 50 years or so, we've just accentuated them.
Yep. So
Ian Ellis, he was on a podcast on this platform not too long ago, and he spoke of this idea that if you're imagining a graph where it peaks and then troughs and then peaks and then troughs, and that's indicating a flood and then a drought, the peaks and troughs are just bigger.
Yep.
And that causes, or the fact that they're bigger, traditionally a river could bounce back from that, and a blackwater event, and we're going to break that down, is a natural event, but it's how big they're getting, which means we can't bounce back from it, and the native fish can't bounce back from it. Is that kind of the premise when you say they're natural and now we've made them worse?
Well, if you look at it, and we can really unpack the science on that. But let's talk about droughts, and let's talk about droughts in the Darling Barker. Historically, when they had a drought, and this is the most extreme drought you would get, because people always use that argument. They say, it dried out all the time. Even when the Darling dried out, this is pre-dams and weirs, there would be 400 or 500 megalitres a day of flow in the river. So the river was still flowing even in the worst droughts. And so the river was always moving. Now the river completely stops or goes down to a really low level of flow. And that's something that never used to happen historically. And so what we're seeing is more extreme droughts. And it's probably the same with floods. And so, I won't say it's probably the same, it is the same with floods. The river used to flood on average every 2 to 3 years. And so every 2 to 3 years you would have this big, and sometimes multiple times a year, you would have this big influx of flow, would go over the floodplains, clear all the sticks and leaves off the floodplains, fill all the billabongs, all of that stuff. Then it would go down, then it would rain, and it would do it again, and it would go down and rain, and you would see that cycle. And then you would transition from drought to flood over around 20 years. And so that was the cycle of the river, the historic hydrology. Now, in 2018-19, we saw probably the most extreme weather we've ever seen. And we transitioned to flood in 4 years. So now we're seeing the transitions from drought to flood quicker, but the extremes. So the droughts are no flow periods and the floods are really extreme. And so it's just not what it used to be.
So when you talk about the water going up, say for example in a flood, the water going over the banks up into the floodplains, in the trees, sticks, shrubs, all that, it then sits there for a while, decomposes that matter, and then seeps back into the main basin.
Yep.
You're saying that's natural, but because that's, I guess, all that organic matter is now bigger, there's more of it, and it's sitting there for longer, you're saying the effects of that are just more pronounced.
Yeah, a lot of the events we see, these flood events, in the southern basin, we see them on average now about every 10 to 20 years. From 2000 up until 2011-12 was a really big dry patch. We went through the millennium drought. So you've gone through the extremest of extremes. And when you've got all of the plant matter on the floodplain, so all of the trees, when there's no water, the trees get sick, right? And so what do trees do when they get sick? They drop their leaves. They drop branches. And so that just accumulates. And someone explained it to me once. This was probably the best way. They said, when it does eventually flood, it's like making a big cup of tea. So, you dunk your tea leaves into your tea bag and then the colours seep out of the tea leaves into the water and it changes colour.
Yeah.
It's the same thing on a floodplain. So
interesting.
So the water is absorbed by the sticks and the leaves, and the tea basically comes out. And so when you've got that situation, so that's all the nutrients coming out of the sticks and leaves, then you've got high temperatures. So the high temperatures that's perfect for bacteria. So you've got high nutrients, which the bacteria need to live.
Yep.
You've got warm temperatures, then all of a sudden things start to go south and the oxygen starts to get sucked out.
And is this what you're referring to now as a blackwater event?
That's a blackwater event. It's a giant, big cup of tea.
So when you say blackwater event, you're talking about, obviously organic matter. And when that seeps back, so the water chews all that, decomposes it, that process chews oxygen, seeps back into the main basin. But that's not what causes the fish kill, is it?
No, it's the lack of oxygen.
It's the lack of oxygen. So when that water seeps back in, does that sit at a certain layer? So you know how, for example, hot air rises.
Yep.
Does water without oxygen sit at a different, spot in that water column than water with oxygen?
It really depends on the water itself. I mean, there was a really big fish kill following the floods in 2011-12 when it had been so long since there was a flood that there was so much material on the floodplain that when it became inundated and it got warm, even though the water was flowing, there was that much bacteria sucking the oxygen out of the water that there was nothing they could do. So that water was, it was flowing low oxygen water. And there were dead fish from Echuca all the way down into South Australia on that event. You're talking hundreds of thousands of fish were dying in that event. Big Murray cod, big golden perch, silver perch, and there's big Murray cod.
Well, they're the ones that grab everyone's attention.
Well, they grab everyone's attention, but they're also the hardest ones to replace, right? Because it takes 60 years to grow a big Murray cod.
Yep.
There's no other way to grow a big Murray cod than wait 60 years. So everyone that dies, it takes 60 years to replace that fish.
Well, you've kind of mentioned it there, 2011. Let's start there, right? So in terms of our timeline that we mentioned earlier, we're going to work from 2011 through to 2023.
Righto.
What happened in 11? You touched on it just briefly.
Yep.
And what did we learn? So I know you weren't on that panel, but you must have had to refer back to events like in 11 to better inform you on 2018, for example. So what do we know about 2011?
Well, number one, they didn't have a panel at that stage. So there was a bit of a response between the feds and the state agencies. What do we do? How do we get out? But it was an emergency management response. Right? It wasn't really about what led to that situation happening. The learnings were that it had been so long since the flood that the science said that there was a critical amount of matter. Can I call them sticks and leaves?
Yeah,
whatever
sticks and leaves.
There was a critical amount that has to be on the floodplain to trigger a blackwater event. So if you're below that amount, and it's like tonnes per hectare is what they did it in. So if you're below that amount, you're unlikely to get a blackwater event. If you're over that amount, you're very likely to get a blackwater event. So they got better at being able to predict if it's going to happen just by knowing how many sticks and leaves were on the ground. The other one was we had a lot of fish dying in rivers. I mean, they were just turning up dead everywhere. What they found was they could use water from irrigation channels, which didn't have low oxygen. It was actually normal water. And they could pump that water into areas where fish were dying, and that created these refuge zones. And so you would pump good water into where there was bad water, and you'd end up with this like plume of areas where fish could survive, and the fish would just go straight into them. And you'd see fish up near the surface or gulping air but surviving. And so they learned at that point that there was a way that they can manage during a fish kill event to stop fish from dying. So the two main things that came out of it was, one, we learnt what the critical mass was for that to occur, and two, there were ways we could save fish during an event, because you can't oxygenate 500 kilometres of river.
But you can create refuge sites.
Yeah, and every fish that survives in a refuge site is a fish that can spawn the season after.
That's two big takeaways in my book. That was a big learning experience.
Yeah,
no?
massive, yeah.
Because if you're looking back at 2011 and going, right, what did we learn? I reckon there too. Well, we'll soon see. But that's a positive in my book.
That was a positive. The third thing we learnt from a scientific point of view was a lot of scientists said, there's so many fish dying. Can we put the dead fish to good use? And so we collected. I don't know if have you done a session yet on fish ear bones?
No.
Otoliths?
No.
Right. This is pretty cool stuff. Right. So fish have these ear bones. They're called otoliths. And if you Google them, you'll see one. They very much look like if you cut a tree and you see the rings on a tree.
Yep.
Exactly the same principle for fish ear bones. And so we collected a lot of ear bones from the dead fish to see what we could learn about these fish. We wanted to know how old the fish were, so to give some sort of estimate of how long it will take to recover. But one thing that's fascinating is that as a fish grows, every day of its life, it lays down a new layer of bone on its ear bone, right? So it gets bigger, and that's what creates the rings. And so you see different times of the year, because fish are cold-blooded, at different times of the year they lay down rings faster than they do at other times of the year. And so we see these bands come out, so you can work out how old a fish is based on the rings on its ear bone. But what's very interesting and happens with fish is that they tend to, when they lay down a layer of bone on their ear bone, they capture the actual water quality. It's the chemical composition of the water at that time, where the fish was. And so we ended up having this amazing sort of timeline of where the fish were. And so the other major learning out of that was when we compared the water quality of the ear bones of the dead fish with the actual water quality in the basin, what we learnt was that the Murray River, or the tributaries that flow into the Murray, have very different water chemistry to the Darling Barker. And so you can work out the chemistry of a fish's ear bone and where it was born based on the chemical signature. And what we found was a lot of the fish that died in the southern basin, this is around places like Deniliquin and Echuca, were actually born in the Darling. So a lot of people say, wow, I've caught a big golden perch, say, in Deniliquin. Isn't it doing good? But that fish has actually been born in the Darling. It has gone down to the Murray River when it was a larvae and then migrated up the Murray to Deniliquin. And so what we found was that the basin itself is a lot more interconnected than what we thought, because these fish are moving at hundreds of kilometres of scales. And so if you want to recover fish in Deniliquin following a fish kill, you actually have to look after the Darling.
So you're not isolating pockets of the basin and spending a lot of time on that. Now it's I don't want to say a global scale, but it's a whole system scale as opposed to a particular township.
Well, they introduced after all of those learnings, they introduced a new term. They call it the Southern Connected Basin. So they no longer talk about the Murrumbidgee and the Murray and the Goulburn. They talk about the Southern Connected Basin because we know that at that scale, fish are moving up all of those rivers all the time.
So it's all well and good to say that, a fish in the Murray ends up at Deniliquin. Like, what does that tell you? What did you, when you first saw this, what did you get excited about?
We got excited about the fact that when you see a fish kill, right, you think this is going to take a very, very long time for this system to recover. What we saw post the fish kill was fish very quickly going back to those areas. So we thought that fish would only be able to recover from intensive restocking or from those fish that were in the refuge zones.
Yeah.
What we actually found was that fish were migrating from the areas outside and coming back to those zones a lot quicker than we thought. So the resilience in the fish population is pretty strong. So it has a pretty big management implication in that you don't do site-based management for fish, and you have to do region scale management and you have to integrate it. And we'll probably get onto that a bit later on. Yeah,
very good. So that was 2011. Obviously there was no specific panel, but there was, there was learnings to come from it. What's the timeline look from then? When was the next notable, event in this story?
So there was another one in 2016 when there was a flood, and again that followed a dry period, but but they were in the southern basin, right? So the Darling Barker wasn't affected at that time. There was no big fish kills there. And it wasn't until we got to the big one, which was 2018-19, and that hit the headlines. That's when...
So the other two flew under the radar a little bit.
Yeah. They were bad. And, people had videos of crayfish crawling out of the river and sitting on riverbanks, for instance, and the fish upside down and dying. But when you see millions of fish dead in a single reach... Yeah, that's when the red flag was raised.
Right. And was it the same causes as we saw in 2011? Because they were both drought orientated as opposed to 23, which was...
Yeah, so 11, 12 and 2016 were really high flow events and in the southern basin. So they sort of emanated from the Murray. The 2018-19 was all in the Darling Barker.
Yep.
And that was from extreme low flow. So that was a period of time where, as I said earlier, the Darling just stopped flowing.
Yeah, literally stopped flowing.
Literally stopped flowing. So there wasn't... Well, it sort of trickled down and trickled down and trickled down, but it was like the perfect storm was brewing.
Yeah.
So we had high nutrients in the river, which prompted a blue-green algal bloom. And the blue-green algae just, over summer, it just got bigger and bigger. We had the Menindee lakes, which were slowly, the water was either evaporating and it was getting drawn down, just bit by bit by bit, and eventually they ran out of water in the Menindee lakes. So there was no more water to disperse the algal event. And as you said before, this is where the the weir pool stratified. So I say that you quite often, like on a hot day, you might jump in for a swim in a farm dam and it's really warm up the top.
Yeah.
And then you got that cold bit down the bottom.
I think that's the case on swimming pools generally.
Everything.
Everything, yeah.
Yep. That's what happened in the Weir 32 weir pool. So you had this really super warm top layer, which was full of algae. It was warm. That's where all the fish were sitting. Below that, you had this area which had zero oxygen. So we say it's stratified. So there was no mixing between that warm layer and the cold layer at the bottom. So the warm layer at the bottom dominated by algae and fish. So during the day, the algae's, it's producing oxygen. It's a plant, right? So plants produce oxygen. So during the day, it's producing all of this oxygen. But at night, it actually uses oxygen. So the opposite thing happens. So at night, the fish and the algae would suck the oxygen out. And so you see this big spike. So during the day, high oxygen, at night, low oxygen. During the day, high. That was in that top layer. In the bottom layer, it just got worse and worse. It just got...
Is that because the sun's not getting down to that in the middle of the day? Like the sun's the catalyst here?
The sun's a catalyst because it's superheating that top layer.
Yep.
And there's no wind and there's no flow, so it's not mixing.
Yep.
So you've only got about 1 metre. You've got 1 metre part of the weir pool that can support fish. That bottom layer, which is still fairly warm, the bacteria are just growing and growing and growing and growing and sucking out all of the oxygen. But what happened in 2018-19 was there was 3 cool changes swept through. And something happened during those cool changes where the weir pool flipped. And so the bad oxygen mixed with the top oxygen, this is the theory anyway, the bad oxygen mixed with the top layer, when the low oxygen went up to the fish, bang, they just all died.
So
they just suffocated instantly.
This is stratification,
This is stratification.
Okay, this is what I really want to get to because multiple people have written about it and say the word, but it's quite often, it doesn't get broken down. So there's 2 layers. Now, just before we get to the layers, is there the perfect storm for algae to grow?
You need warm temperature and you need high nutrients.
And warm temperature comes from stagnant water, no?
Well, you could just have a hot patch. And what happened in that time was they just had day after day after day of 40+ temperatures.
Right.
So it was just basically cooking the water. And so 40+, the temperature just went up, 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 up. As the temperature goes up, 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 the algae
loves it.
Just starts producing more algae. And then what happened after the first fish kill? So the first fish kill happened when that cool change come through and it flipped and it mixed.
Yep.
All the dead fish sink to the bottom. And what does that do? The bacteria break down the dead fish and they suck out more. So the fish kill was actually, it created what we call a positive feedback loop. The more fish that died and went to the bottom, the bacteria loved it.
Isn't that
and
interesting?
It just got worse and worse.
So the kill actually started before any civilians saw it because the fish that were in that top layer died, sunk to the bottom. The algae loved it.
Oh, the bacteria.
The bacteria loved it.
Yeah.
That created nearly more of a perfect storm for that bottom layer to even become more inhabitable.
Yep.
And then on the next cool change, the next time that water flipped, any fish that were left in that top layer will had even less of a chance.
Yep.
And that's when the whole system just turned.
Yep. Yeah.
Right.
And so that just kept cycling. And so there was 3 cycles of that through that summer until winter started to approach and the temperatures dropped. And when the temperatures dropped, that's when the algae don't like it as much. So the nutrients were still high and there was still some algae there, but it wasn't as intense as it was. And then eventually you get to winter and the stratification breaks down.
Okay. So I love the word you said there, a perfect storm. It sounds like it wasn't the result of one particular thing, or these events aren't the result of one particular thing where you go, it's because of this. It's this thing combined with this thing combined with this thing, which eventually leads to, the perfect storm.
Yep.
So the three main ones you spoke about was having a lot of sticks and leaves, right?
Yep.
An excessive amount of sticks and leaves on the floodplains, as opposed to what would usually be there because we have more, a naturally controlled way of getting rid of those sticks and leaves.
Yep.
Then when they break down and enter into the water, there is, more water going in there with a lack of oxygen because of how accentuated the sticks and leaves were.
Yep.
Then it's the hot
So that's
day.
a blackwater fish
That's
kill.
the blackwater fish kill.
Yep.
Then it's the hot days, back to back to back, 40 degrees, 40 degrees, 40 degrees, which creates this breeding ground for the bacteria, for the algae, sorry. And then you kind of divide the water column up into, part A, part B, the top layer, the bottom layer.
Yep.
And that sits there for a few days and weeks and does its thing till you get really kind of conflicting, environments in the water, and then it's the cool change which comes through in this case and flips the water, and that happens, you know, a couple of times until one time it just gets too much for it and they all die.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. And that's the stratification fish kill, and that happens during the low flow.
And that was
periods.
18.
That was 18, 19.
Right.
Yeah.
Now you're on the panel.
Yep.
So run me through that. Actually, just on a personal anecdote, when you get the call that fish are starting to die, you know, me, I'm like, someone in my position goes, oh no, that's terrible. But for you who are really quite ingrained in it, you're probably going, oh no, that's terrible. Oh wait, hang on, we've got a big few months coming up. You know, because you're involved in a much stronger capacity than I am. So what do you do when you see this news? Do you go like, oh yep, I expected that, you know, because you've seen the perfect storm brewing, or is it kind of like, not again?
Well, the funny thing was in that particular case, there were warning bells going off every 2 weeks, right? It was like, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And there was no response, right? And it just got worse and worse and worse, and all of a sudden, bang, the fish died. And you do have a bit of a told you so moment. You say, you know, this was a warning for a very, very long time. But at the same time, and this is one of the challenges, is because Menindi's quite remote, right? Menindi's really hard to get to. And so it's not until the locals played a massive part in A, raising the profile of the plight of the Darling Barker, but B, also responding. You know, when they got out there with their smartphones and started showing the world what happened, you know, as a fish scientist, I go, wow, thank you.
Yes.
Because that was the first time it's the first time that people in sort of Melbourne and Sydney connect with there being a big problem with water, right? Because a lot of people don't leave the cities and don't get out that way.
Yeah.
And so when I was doing, I got called for a ABC radio, ABC TV interview one night at like 7 at night. That's unheard of. No one wants to hear about fish at 7 o'clock at night. It's just after dinner. And that's when I kind of clicked, wow, people are actually caring about this for the first time. Because I would say prior to that 18-19 event, when I was at New South Wales DPI and then I went into this, we'd be responding to fish kill events every couple of years. And so,
it became a part of your job.
It's a part of the job that you don't enjoy.
Yeah.
But it just happens so often. And we finally saw, wow, people care about this and something might be done. And then politicians turned up.
Yep.
Then the senior government department people turned up. There were people on the side of the river. I mean, you said politicians gagging because they couldn't handle the smell. And it's like, wow, you know, you don't know how many times we've done that in the last 10 years. This is normal.
Why Menindee? Why is it always Menindee?
It's a really, that's a really good question, actually.
Because Menindee's been put on the map.
Yep.
But I had no idea where Menindee was, you know, before, 18 to be fair, because I was much younger. Menindee was just I don't know where it is type thing, but now everyone's like, oh, Menindee, yeah, we're 32.
Yep.
You know? And
again, as I said before, this is kind of our fault because we created it. And the whole Menindee Lake system was established I think it went live in 1960. And it was set up as a way that they could store water to send down to South Australia and meet South Australia's water requirements. So it's got what we would call an off-river storage. So it's capture the water, then release it.
Yeah.
After the system, and it was built at Menindee because these old big salt basin lakes, they're natural occurring lakes, right? They would have filled naturally over thousands of years, were just sitting there. And they worked out, wow, if we just build this giant levee bank across the Darling and pushed water into these natural lakes, we could actually use that as a storage. And that's how it happened. And so at that point when they built this, and if you go down there and look at the Menindee Main Weir, it's just a giant levee bank across the river, 9 metres high, which pushes water into the lakes. And so that's why Menindee is, because that was the area that was deemed the best spot for that engineering solution. But when you go downstream of Menindee, there's Weir 32, then there's Pooncarie Weir, and there's Batundi Weir. Weir 32 is probably the most substantially sized weir in that part of the river, and it stratifies really easy. And so it's deep. Deep pools in the Darling aren't natural, so we don't see them. It's deep, and it has periods of low flow for a long period.
When you
of time.
say deep,
a couple of metres.
Yeah,
a couple of metres deep.
Right.
So and it Yeah, but it's the periods of low flow when you get that stratification.
Yeah.
And that's where it happens in that area, because if you go upstream of the Menindee main weir, it tends to still be flowing because they use that area to divert water into the lakes. And so you don't often see the stratification as much as you do downstream. It effectively stops the Darling at that point.
Is there any other spots along the Murray or the Darling which potentially have the same recipe for disaster as Menindee does? And I draw an analogy to earthquakes, for example. We know what towns in and around the world, what cities are likely to have an earthquake.
Yep.
New Zealand, Japan, because they're on tectonic plates, right? And we go, well, you have a higher chance than us. Is there other spots, other bends of the river, other towns that you look at and you go, you know what? You haven't had one yet, but you are damn close to Menindee by way of how high the weir is, whatever it might be, that you should be on high alert.
It really depends on the conditions at the time. So we knew Menindee was going to happen because we were just running out of water that year. But that was a case across the basin. And anyone who's watching this can Google that year. That wasn't the only fish kill. There were fish kills all over the place because most of the northern basin rivers dried up. And so there were fish kills in the Macquarie that year, for instance. So a lot of the guys in the Macquarie River actually were spending their time on weekends rescuing fish from drying pools and relocating them to good areas. There were parts of the Namoy which dried out that year.
Right.
But that year, I mean, we're talking about perfect storm.
Yeah.
The other thing that contributed to that perfect storm was we knew that was going to happen across the whole basin, and there was very little that could be done. A, because there wasn't enough water to fix up the situation, and B, there's simply just not enough sets of hands to rescue all the fish that needed to be rescued. And so they prioritised a little bit about where they could put resources to fix things up. But I don't think they expected Menindee to be as bad as it was. No one expected millions of fish to die. That was surprising.
Run us through the panel experience, because it was your first one.
Yep.
What's it like? And I want to dive into like more of a personal note here, but what's it like kind of meeting on the first day with a bunch of other colleagues, for example? You might have met a few of them, all from different departments, has different expertise, and you kind of all sit down at a round table. This is what I'm imagining. Where do we start? You know what I mean? Like it's that first, like, what are we doing? Type thing. Is it that simple? Because I think what I'm trying to break down here is when a wreck angler, for example, hears that a panel's been put together or there's an investigation into something, no one knows what happens there. We can try imagine what happens, and you'd think a bunch of smart people are sitting down going, how do we solve this? But run us through what a panel experience actually looks like. And just for transparency for people out there that have faith in the people that are looking into these things.
The first panel meeting, I mean,
if you say it was at a pub, we're going to have a big issue.
No, it was actually at the hotel down at Tullamarine Airport. We didn't really know each other at that time. And so the first meeting is about really getting to know each other and what your expertise was. And then, we had an expert in Darling-Barker River hydrology. We had an expert in algae. We had an expert in management. We had, it was really good just to sit down and hear everyone's expertise. Then you have this, right, how are we going to unpack this?
Yep.
And we basically said, this is a bit of an investigation. We kind of knew it wasn't that hard to work out what killed the fish, right? Lack of oxygen, the fish died. But for us, it wasn't enough to say, lack of oxygen, end of story, close the case, move on.
Yep.
It was really about, okay, well, what led to the low oxygen? And that's what the interesting part of the investigation was. So we arrived at the cause of the deaths really quickly. That was 2 weeks in.
Yep.
How it got to that stage, that took a bit more, and that required trips to Menindee. That required talking to a hell of a lot of people, and probably the most confronting thing about a fish kill is that not a single person is happy with what's happened. Right. The government's not happy with what's happened. The community's not happy with what's happened. First Nations people, fishers, ecologists, you name it. No one's happy. And so
no party has benefited.
Not a single person has benefited
and that's
at all.
rare, I think. Usually there's one or two other organisations or people that kind of benefit from a particular something, like COVID, for example. People made a lot of money at COVID, certain investments and whatnot. Yeah. Pharmaceutical companies, blah, blah, blah. But fish kills, Zilch.
Nothing.
Unless you really hate fish, which I don't think there's anyone out there that does that.
No. Well, I mean, and these are native fish, right? So, you know,
Yeah,
if
exactly.
they were carp.
If they were carp, happy
maybe.
days. Yeah.
But no, not with native fish. It's but it's also a lot of people who we spoke to. It was the first time in decades that they'd had the opportunity to actually sit down with people and be heard. And so that was confronting because people are very emotional. People are passionate about healthy rivers. People don't want to see this happening. But also people have a range of different perspectives on what they think happened. And so collecting all of those ideas and perspectives was an interesting part. That was the non-scientific, that was the human side of the investigation. And we quickly realised that this is not about fish, this is about people.
Yeah, interesting. Different connections to the river. So when it came to the scientific part, you know, we spoke about what we learnt in 2011. What did we learn in 2018? What did the panel kind of come up with to relay back to the government at the time, for example, or to communicate to the community?
Oh, there was like dozens of recommendations we made to the government. And the government of the day accepted all of them, right? And so there was recommendations around, one, where was our early warning system? So no, we weren't even listening to the river, or where we were listening to the river, we weren't actually listening. We were just watching. So,
and what's an early warning sign? This is because it's like a bushfire to me. There's an evacuation when there's a bushfire threat. There's people that trigger you to say, get out of your house. You're out of here. I don't care what you want to keep. You're in the car and you're out of here. No one ignores that.
Yeah. But the algae was there. We were running out of water. The weir pool was stratified, but there was no real action taken because no one really knew what to do. Then after the first fish kill happened, everyone said, well, it's oxygen, right? It's clearly oxygen. So let's get some oxygen back in the river. And that's where, and for some reason these things always happen over Christmas or on holiday periods or over a weekend. You always find yourself really quickly getting to this at the worst possible time. So what are the solutions? Aerators. Venturi systems. Can we use pumps to recirculate water to create those low flow zones we were talking about?
They're Band-Aids though, aren't they?
They're Band-Aids, but fish survived. Right. So fish survived. So we knew that this was going to happen again, and this wasn't the last time. So we said, okay, if it does happen again, what can you do to save as many fish as possible? Translocating fish, so taking dying fish out, putting them in good water, taking them back at the end. That was another thing that they did. But probably the biggest thing, and probably the most disappointing thing for me, was that it was a river operations thing. And so we made very strong recommendations that the government, the federal and the state government should think about how they operate the Menindee system and come up with a new way of operations. Just sit down, go back to the table, throw away everything you've learnt about that and try it again.
And you're referring to the weir there, aren't you?
The weir and the diversion of water
to the lakes
and how you manage when's it in federal government control, when's it in state government control, what's the decision-making process? We said, can you just go back to the drawing board and rethink it? And neither the state or federal government responded to that. You know, when they said, here's our response to all of the recommendations, the box was blank from both. And you go, that's probably the number one thing you could do is just push the water through differently or change your operating rules. But because it had been done that way since 1960, you know, it was almost like that's how it's always been done. That's how we're always going to keep doing it.
So there was a response to a lot of the quick fix Band-Aid solutions, and everyone, the way I look at that is, we're looking to do something now. That's an easy fix. Oh, reinvent the whole system. Yeah, can't do that one.
That's right. Yeah, and I still to that day believe that that's what's needed. That needs to be a co-designed solution with community, with fishers, with First Nations people, with river managers, with the feds, with the states. They all need to get together and say, how can we do this better?
I'm going to put you in charge. You might not have an answer. I don't expect you to have one. What would you like to see it look like, that particular river management system?
Well, it hasn't got an integrated solution, and that's probably what the biggest recommendation out of the ladder panel we just did was there's no one. You just can't slap a Band-Aid over it and fix it, right? You have to rethink how you allocate water, how much water you allocate, how you manage the system at high flows and low flows, how you create, back to what Ozfish does, how do you create better habitat at the right times to get fish, how do you get fish migrating through? Fish ladders, fish migration pathways. How do you support eggs and larvae? How do you support the adult fish? It is such a bigger solution than we could explain right here.
Yep.
It's going to take years to come up with the operating, but you have to start, right? You have to make a start, and it's not going to be easy, but you're definitely going to end up in a better spot than you are right now.
Before we move to the most recent one, if we were to start now, for example, let's say that the book was thrown out. Is it something that can be? Is it a 5-year plan? Is it a 10-year plan? 2-year plan? How big of a task is this to get it back to where it needs to be?
Well, there's immediate things you do to sort of stop the severity of the events we're seeing, right? Because they're going to keep happening.
Yeah,
we haven't done enough to change things to get that happening. So straight away you'd go in and say, right, what's going to happen this year? What can we do this year to minimise anything? And so the very first thing you would do is triage those problems. The second thing you do is go, okay, we've got through this year. So between 1 and 5 years, what are the next suite of things we can implement? Because some of these solutions, even in a post-COVID world, if you go, we're going to build a fish ladder to get fish through that levee bank, to get them out of the affected zone. Takes a year to design, takes a year to construct. You're at least 2 years, best case scenario, assuming you can get enough concrete trucks and engineers out there to build the thing.
And half of them don't work.
The fish ladders, they work if they're operated
if
they're operated and designed
There's
well.
A few cases where,
so.
Speaking to Martin, he said he worked on the first really successful one, but before that, he offers a great spiel on his episode episode 1 actually, where he goes, they were never monitored. Before, I forget what date, I should remember, but provided we build an effective one, that is, so.
Let's go back to salmon, right? Let's go back to our chat about salmon. We know salmon, strong swimmers, charge upstream, spawn and die, right? All that fish ladder has to do for a salmon is get them from point A to point B in the quickest time possible so that they can drop their eggs and melt.
Because they're not coming back.
They're not coming back.
Yeah.
Australian fish go up, then the eggs and larvae come back. And then they grow and then they go up again and then they come back, and some of the adults are going 3,000 kilometres and some of them are going from the Darling to Danilo. It's much more complex.
Yep.
But all of the solutions early on were salmon solutions,
and trout,
not
and
Aussie solutions.
Yeah.
And that was the big problem.
Yep.
Now we know a lot more about designing Aussie solutions, so we do it way better than we used to do it.
You just mentioned something before. What is this idea of hydrology? What's the term mean? What for someone complete novice?
Yep.
Break down the concept of hydrology.
Effectively, hydrology is just the term used to describe flows in the river.
Right.
So floods,
Yep.
droughts, everything in between. When the water breaks the banks and goes onto the floodplains and fills the billabongs, when it drains back in, when it comes from tributaries.
Yeah.
You would just say it's the way the river flows. That's the hydrology.
So when talking about the 2018 fish kills, it sounds like flow is one of the major issues, because you spoke about the weir and then that water builds up. Would knocking down Weir 32 fix a lot of problems, or would it create more?
Both. So, Weir 32 is stored, and it's water that's used for recreation, for instance.
Yeah.
People go fish. So if you knock down Weir 32, all of a sudden there goes your weir pool that you go fishing in on the weekend. So you can't go skiing, for instance. You can't pump water out of it for your crops, for your gardens, for towns. So it does serve a purpose in that regard. But you can be strategic in what ones you would release. So you could potentially lower Weir 32 a little bit to a depth that doesn't stratify. You could operate it differently. In a sort of dry period, you might run it at a lower level to stop the stratification to happen. They're all things you can do, right? But it all depends. The answer to that is it depends. If you got to 18, 19 and you lowered that weir pool and there was no more inflows, then you've kind of cut your nose off to spite your face, because you go, wow, we've got no more water for the town. We're going to have to ship water in.
Yep.
And so water managers have to make an incredibly complex number of decisions when they have absolutely no idea when it's going to rain again.
Yeah.
And so it's a real balancing act. You've
So
got to grow water for food.
Yeah.
You need water for the river to be safe.
Fish aren't the only people these days. The only
That's right.
thing that's requiring water. I understand that. So 2018 came around. You jumped on the panel. You created 12 recommendations. I think you said majority of them were looked at.
Dozens
of recommendations. Unfortunately, one wasn't looked at all, which was around the whole river management system. You touched on a couple there. What were some of the quick fix Band-Aid solutions that you mentioned? I think you spoke about, was there aerators? Was that aerators and the idea of making an industrial size aerator?
Yep.
And that's really about just saving the fish there and then waiting for that winter period to come round to then reduce the stratification, and then those fish can have another successful year.
Yep.
What were some other solutions? And excuse me, what did we learn from them? Are we still using them today, or was there some that went, no, we're never using that again,
Look, the translocations one was the other one, was getting fish out of the bad area and moving them somewhere good and then bringing them back. They still don't have a good handle on whether that worked that well or not, but it's visible and it's something.
It looks good.
What's the alternative? Is the fish died anyway? So you might as well do something.
Try. Yeah.
But they're very expensive, right? It's very expensive to send teams of people remotely to rescue fish, take them back, look after those fish for 6 months, and then take them back. That's a really expensive way of doing it. So setting up local refuges could be a lot better. The main ones you do, though, is by the time it stratifies, and by the time, aerators are another one, but bubble plumes. So could you put a giant aerator, like a fish tank aerator, on the bottom that constantly mixes the water and keeps things moving?
Isn't that what happens in impoundments to reduce cold water pollution?
Yep, spot on.
So why is that not? Why has someone not said? And they might have. Pull me up here, but why has someone not said, let's create that in a river instead of an impoundment? Because the same issue's happening. Instead of cold water being released into rivers, which is killing fish, it's just deoxygenated water.
Yeah, it's part of the mix. It's part of the mix of solutions you do, but then you might need a 3-phase power source or a diesel generator, and you need someone to look after it, and you need someone to refuel it, and it all becomes something you have to maintain. What would be better is not having to do that at all. Right, is fixing the problem so that you never have to think about that as a solution. And so when we think longer term, which is, you asked how long is long term, it's definitely 10 to 15 years and beyond. Okay. is where you fix things up. So we've got the quick fix solutions, the aerators, the moving fish around. We've got in the medium term, you might do things like altering the operations, making sure you've got more environmental flows when you need them to disperse flows and things like that. But the big ones, which is rethink the infrastructure and rethink the ops, is a big coordinated 10-year discussion. You got to think it's taken us. Menindee system went in 1960. Yeah. And what's that? That's 60 years. So we're not going to fix a 60-year problem in 5 years. Yeah. It's got to take a long time to fix it.
You'd think, someone might think you take a bunch of learnings out from 2018 and the next time it happens, we're onto it, we're good to go. Run us through what happened in 23, particularly leading up to it. Did we have the early warning signs where they responded to? I understand this was very much around flood instead of drought now. So was everything you learnt in 2018 redundant because of it was a different catalyst?
It was, in a way, because the river was flowing at this point, and that there was a big slug of water coming down from the northern basin, which had bad water quality, and it was tracked for several weeks as it came down. Then when it hits Lake Wetherill, which is this Menindee levee bank we are talking about, you can either let it come straight through or you can move it into the lakes. And so at that point, the main gates were shut off, and then the water started getting diverted into the Menindee main weir. And it was thought that if they go into the main lakes, that would disperse and reoxygenate and come good. But what happened, and there's some really good reports that were submitted to the investigation. Some of the water, one of the theories, the water sort of went into the lake and then went straight back into the river via the release. So it was actually releasing the bad water downstream, and the water quality got quite bad. And then the same situation occurred, right? We ended up with low oxygen water filling up and no real way to disperse it. But I don't think what anyone really expected was to see 20 kilometres of dead fish, and they're estimating 30 million fish died. And one thing that we absolutely learn, I know everyone's focusing on it right now, is how do you count how many fish are in a stretch of river? And so if you don't know how many fish are in a stretch of river, you don't know what the fish kill risk likely is. And so you go, what happened since 2018-19? So we said, wow, we need to help this stretch of river recover. So let's get the fishways operating downstream. So that starts passing all of these fish upstream into the affected reach. So fish start coming back up the river and they start moving up. They said, we've got to make sure that the water quality is okay. So the water quality has been maintained in a really good way for the last few years. So you've got all of these fish concentrating in this one pool and no way for them to get up the mid-Darling Barker. So they go up to this area and they stop. And the way the analogy I kind of said was this was like, you see those videos of a conveyor belt at a food processing plant and you just see the packets of food just going up. That's what we were doing for fish for several years. And they can't get any further. Imagine you stop that up and so it just, the food just piles up. That's exactly what happened to the fish. That weir pool over those years, high nutrients, so it grows plankton. Yep. The baby fish eat the plankton. Yep. They grow really quickly. So a couple of good years of spawning. We saw some big spawning years where golden perch and Murray cod floated down the river. They call them drift down the river, floated down the river into the Menindee Lakes, which is an amazing sort of nursery ground for them. Then they end up back in the main channel. So you've got the Menindee Lakes seeding the main channel, fish charging up from downstream. But no one really knew how many fish were there. Then we had this huge explosion of carp numbers. Like carp
yes, I remember seeing that.
Nuts. Like more carp than you've ever seen. So there was just so many fish in that area that when the bad water quality hit, boom. Another perfect. It's
like a perfect storm.
But it's a different storm, right? It was a perfect storm, but completely different to the storm that hit in 2018.
So to break down what you've just said, between 18 and 23, the 5 years there, water quality bounced back in that particular area around Menindee. And that's perhaps due to concentrated efforts in that area, but also because of, high water flows. There was, a lot of rain throughout that period. We just had a huge bushfire event. So naturally, that area started to become like a little bit of a nice little sanctuary, a nice little, golden zone, whatever you want to call it, where all these fish started to kind of migrate to, and they were going up over the weir. Is that right? Yeah. And then when they could no longer get up over the top, they just started banking up. And a lot of the fish found themselves in this, how many kilometre area do you reckon?
And the weir pool's huge, right? Yeah. But it was just filling up with fish for years.
For years. So, but naturally, that particular weir pool would, let's say, for conversation's sake, held 10 fish. In this particular time, it was holding 100 fish. You know what I mean? So the reason 23 looked so bad and was probably on, such a grand scale was because there was so many fish had made their way to that area that when the event went bad, it didn't go bad for 10 fish, it went bad for 100 fish. And that's why the imagery and the drone shots we see, flying is just incredible. Like millions of fish, upwards of the numbers of potentially 30 million.
There's a video on YouTube by Graham McCrabb, one of the guys who lives locally there, where he just mounted the GoPro in the front of his boat and he just flew up, and it's just acres and acres and acres of dead fish.
I think
you should drop that in right now over the top of this.
We can certainly
because it's that's the bit when as a fish ecologist you go, something's horribly wrong with the way we're managing these rivers.
So let's break that down, because a certain amount of fish being in a particular area is no reason for them to die, right? Yep. That was just a result or something to add to the story of 23. But you don't just die because there's a bunch of people living together or a bunch of fish swimming together, right? There had to be, some other reasons, a lack of oxygen. But run us through why in 23 there was a lack of oxygen, because it had to have been different from 18 in some respects. One was too much water and one was not enough water.
Yeah, the why is a bit... How it ended up that way is there was a lot of runoff from the Northern Basin, right? And a lot of this bad slug of water come down, but there was also algae at the same time. And so there's a couple of conflicting theories as to why we call it. There was this, there's the high biomass theory, right? Which we said, wow, there was just so many fish in that stretch of river that when the bad water hit and had low oxygen, the fish just sucked all the oxygen out because there were so many fish. It'd be like sticking 10,000 people in this room and then shutting off all the windows. Eventually we'll suffocate, right? Same deal. Versus there's actually low quality water coming through that's really bad, that's going to kill the fish. And again, one of the recommendations from the 2018-19 was let's set up an early warning system, but it wasn't set up. So no one can really pinpoint whether it was the stacks of fish or the low oxygen or a combination of both, whether the fish just sucked all the oxygen out or whether it was bad. We need that early warning system to tell us what's going on.
So despite recommending it in 2018, it was never adopted, in which means we don't understand what the true cause is because we don't have any triggers. Is crayfish not leaving the water, or isn't that a good indication that something?
Yep.
Aren't they a canary?
If crayfish aren't in the river,
because I remember the reason I say it is Ozfish volunteers spent months, rescuing crayfish that crawled out of the water and they're perched on a rock. But at that point, we hadn't seen those crazy images yet. It was like, oh, crayfish are leaving the water, something's going to happen, Or is that too late?
Look, in that part of the river, you probably wouldn't see crays going there because the crays are more in the southern basin, right?
Yes.
So at that point, I think it was just the pace at which that bad water hit this year, in that it just came through and just killed whatever was there. What people didn't know was how many fish were there. And so the immediate response to that, and I know the government released their response to the panel report this year. The number one is, how do we estimate the biomass in the river? And so now they're looking at all sorts of crazy technology that they can do runs up and down the river and work out how many fish are there, because that's going to give them an indication of kill risk. So
there's plenty to unpack here. One of them isn't a really good way to find out how many fish are in a particular system is when a fish kill happens. Count the amount of fish that float up to the surface. You get a pretty good indication of how many were there at that time, and then you can kind of... Or is that a really oversimplified...
No, it's a good one because there's two really important points about that statement. Number one is you only see the fish that are floating. You don't see the fish that have sunk. And so there's always more fish that are at the bottom than are floating on the surface. The second one is it's a tremendous amount of nutrients sitting in those dead fish. And so when they do sink, they're going to just promote the bad oxygen situation because they drive the bacterial production. And so we did some water quality investigations following this year's kill. It was only a few months ago, and we just found that the nutrient levels were off the charts. Because of the dead fish, and probably because of runoff as well, it's a ticking time bomb again. And so we know that there's going to be a fish kill this year if the water stops flowing or if it stratifies. What we don't know is how big it's going to be because we don't know how many fish survived last year.
That's a big statement, Lee. A fish kill's coming.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's already started. There was one 2 weeks ago. So a couple of hundred fish already died in the Menindee system. And that's not a low oxygen, so we still don't know why that happened.
Yes. So I don't want to press you too much, but I'm getting the sense that we don't have an answer as to why fish died in 23. We know there was gunshot wounds, right? There was low of oxygen. So it's like rocking up to a crime scene and there's a hole in someone's head. It's like, well, he died from a gunshot. You got to piece together all the other puzzle. How are you saying we know nothing? We know they died from lack of oxygen. We don't know how it happened.
Oh no, what we don't know is whether we could have operated the system differently to prevent it. Right. And that's probably where it comes back to operations. We know there was a bad slug of water come down. We knew there was going to be a fish kill of some degree.
Yep.
We'd hoped that we could have dispersed the bad water in the main lakes, but it didn't quite work out that way. And then we didn't quite know how many fish were downstream. And so I don't think if you had have asked someone at the start of last season, would there be a fish kill? They might have said, if we get the perfect storm of situations, there'll be a fish kill. And if you had have said, do you think 30 million fish will die in one night? They would have said, no chance. We don't even think there's 30 million fish in the river because of the previous fish kill. And so that was a complete surprise to everyone.
That's a slight positive though, isn't it? You had a fish kill in the same area 5 years before and still 30 million fish died.
That's right.
It's not bad. I know it's a bad... I don't like the fact that they died, but...
I get what you mean. It shows that the river's very resilient.
It can bounce back.
It bounces back really quickly. But probably what drove it a lot too was on the back of the last one, there was a lot of carp. you know, and carp are what we call ecosystem engineers. They modify the system to suit them, and they had modified the system to suit themselves. I mean, there's a video, and again, I can send you the video, and you can stick it over the top here. And this was just a couple of weeks before the fish kill happened. This huge school of carp under the bridge in Menindee, and they were going out and sucking zooplankton. So they'd eaten everything else. All that was left to eat was the zooplankton, and they were just zooming out from the bridge, just sucking it. So that you had this huge biomass of carp, you had all of these bonies there. Yeah.
When you say a bad slog of water came down, you know, a bad slog of water, what's that mean?
It's similar to what we saw, because upstream, so the Upper Darling, you have the Narran system, which is, you know, it's a forest, goes under, same thing, sticks and leaves. So you get all of this runoff which comes off into the system. And so this flood went through, filled up the floodplains. Then it went back into the main river channel.
That's it.
And so you made your cup of tea.
There you go.
You made your cup of tea.
That's what we brushed over. When you said like there was a bad slug of water come through, it's like, no, by no means. But I think some of the main publications have, you know, brushed over this too, is that in my preliminary research, and, you know, I'm talking YouTube videos and some articles, there's a lack of explanation around 23, but there's a fair bit of understanding about 18. But you just nailed it on the head. So further up system, the water inundated the flats. There was, you know, too much sticks and leaves. That then drained off, and then there was a pocket of bad water that was eventually, just because the river flows down, was going to get to Menindee. And it's the fact that when it hit Menindee, all the fish were there was a weir there. That's the perfect storm.
That's right. Yep.
And did the stratification process happen again, or was it less an issue of the water flipping and 40-degree days back to back, and more of a situation of there was 30 million fish in one particular weir pool, and when the water hit it, there was the perfect storm was too many fish, not enough oxygen, already bad water coming down through, and potentially even worse water seeping through the Menindee lakes. And
you had a few weeks earlier where at the main levee bank in Menindee, you have what they call the Menindee main weir, which is big, giant 9-metre high gates, and they were closed just before that, and so you had that sudden reduction in flow. There's
the perfect storm.
And so that's what created the perfect storm.
I find it so interesting that you can have two fish kills within 5 years, and they're both from different causes. I get they're the same causes and that they're both revolved around some type of blackwater event, but the perfect storm that we've been alluding to the whole time has just been slightly different.
Yep.
That's not very, you know, I don't like that. It'd be better if it was just one particular thing and you go, right, we've just got to avoid this and we'll never have a fish kill again. But the next fish kill we might have, which you anticipate could be in a couple of months, for example, a couple of weeks even, could be different again.
Yep. I mean, 90% of fish kills worldwide, it doesn't matter if it's in Australia.
Yeah.
They never find out the cause.
Yeah, right.
You just see a whole bunch of dead fish just turn up. And quite often what caused it, that happened beforehand. So you're trying to solve a murder.
Yeah.
If murder's the best word, you're trying to unpack something where the conditions might have already gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a lake in Indonesia a couple of years ago where all the fish just died overnight, and again they thought that inverted. Or every now and then in Mexico, you'll just see all of the pilchards just dead, like thousands of pilchards dead. No obvious cause. It happens. So the fact that we've got an idea of what's going on, that's a positive because you can think about solutions.
Would you say that you took any major things away from 23? We've learnt what you did in 11 and 18. What did we learn from 23, or are we not there yet? From my understanding, you've just finished up your panel commitments, which delayed this podcast, which is great because I'd prefer to have this chat after that's all happened. Can we speak about what you might have learnt in that process?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that they learned is they need to get this early warning system in ASAP. And I think it's all systems go to get that happening, which is a good thing. The number two thing is they need to work out how many fish are in the river. So that gives you an idea of what risk. And number three, you have to have some sort of idea of how you're going to respond in the short term. And, they're even talking about now that we know the fish are accumulating in that Weir 32 reach, they're talking about mobilising and this was in the New South Wales government response. They're now talking about what we call a trap and transport solution, which is they're talking to river rangers, First Nations river rangers and the local community to actually trap fish and move them upstream past the main levee bank as a manual thing to at least try and save some fish before the condition gets bad.
Is there not a fish ladder there already though?
No. The main weir doesn't have a fish ladder. That's one of the problems.
It's a pretty big problem.
It's a massive problem. And it has been the number one. So if you go back to, I started working in this field in 1996 when someone handed me a copy of the native fish sort of strategy plan of the basin. And they had a table in there of priority weirs for fish passage. At the top of that list in 1996 was Menindee Main Weir. It's now 2023 and we still haven't done anything there. And that was one of the recommendations that come out of this year's report is someone needs to write a business case to build a fish ladder at Menindee Main Weir that gets fish out of that zone.
I struggle to understand why that isn't happening. If people like you have identified that it needs to happen and it will go a long way into preventing things like this happening again, you know, am I out of school and thinking that is just complete?
Well, you know, as fishos, you go, yeah, let's save the fish. But, you know, not everyone likes fish, right? Some people like hospitals and some people like schools.
Sure.
And so you have to work out how do you allocate your public money to do a good thing. And so Menindee, we'll put it this way. If it wasn't for the Menindee locals and that 2018-19 event, as you said, you never even heard of Menindee before that. You know, and we only knew about Menindee because we'd done work out there because it's a critical spot. But the majority of people in Australia prior to 2018-19 did not know where Menindee was.
They probably didn't even know about fish kills, to be fair. Social media's done a lot of positive, a lot of negative too, but a lot of positive in this particular scenario because education and awareness is huge.
Yeah. And that was a large part due to the community pulling together and telling the story. And, you know, film crews went out there, probably tech as well, right? Have smartphones and network service out that way where you can in real time do it. The big and a lot of people don't kind of realise where all of this sort of came from. Right?
Yeah.
And if you go right back and say, where did the problem start? It was in 1995. There was a thing called the CAP, right? And I don't know if you've heard of the CAP, right? The CAP was a thing that was brought in by the feds at that point. The feds sort of, what happened in the 90s there was the entire Darling Barker turned green. It turned green, right? There was a blue-green algal event all the way from Queensland down to the bottom end of the Darling. And everyone was in uproar, right? And they said, how on earth can this happen? How can the Darling River turn green? And that was at the point they realised they'd allocated more water for take than there was available water. And the Darling effectively stopped flowing. It stratified. The blue-green algal event happened. And that's when the whole start of water reform happened. It was in 1995. And so if you go back and you say, what happened at that point? That's when they realised more water was going out of the river than was staying in the river. And so that started years and years of discussions. But at that point, in 1995, a mobile phone was still a big bag that sat under the seat in your car and you needed a giant antenna.
Had that happened
and it had
now.
a cord. You know, that story wasn't being told then because you didn't have the you couldn't do it. You couldn't have a podcast then about this and broadcast it to millions of people. So even when the event happened in, you know, there was a Blackwater event in 2006, but you didn't have smartphones then. You had those old Nokias. So, you know, it was a big thing, but you couldn't do it. Now, when these things happen, they are instantly broadcast to millions of people. So the story gets out there way quicker. And so the plight of the Darling is well known now. Probably tech has helped get the story out there.
Massively. It went viral, you know, international media.
Yep.
Just when you grab that microphone and pull it as close as you can.
Sorry, did I get further away?
Yeah, just slightly. There you go, perfect. In terms of the solutions, we've touched on a lot of them, and I'm picking up that early signs are the ones that we really need to focus on. Obviously, potentially 15-year complete overhaul of the river management system. Then there's some band-aid solutions, like maybe a bubble plume, like aerators, like I'm pretty sure paddle steamers were mixing the water there at some point. Is there anything else from Lee's perspective that when a rec angler who's listening to this says, what is going to be done or what needs to be done? Because I think, we don't want to confuse. You're not the one making the calls. You're recommending to the government, this is what should happen. Here's kind of your chance to really add anything in those recommendations that we haven't talked about. What have you recommended that the rec anglers can kind of hear so we get an understanding if it's going to or not be implemented? Is there something we haven't touched on that you think is really important that needs to be done?
Look, the number one thing that stops all of this is that rivers need water. And so you only see, and that rivers need good quality water. And so you're only going to say, everyone wins off a healthy river, right? People can grow crops, the fish survive, fishermen catch fish, towns get their water, everyone's happy. Bad quality water, people are angry, people get sick, fish die, everything. The number one thing that people can do is be advocates for healthy rivers, because if I look at what's the most undervalued resource that we have, it's water. It's we turn on the tap, we get water. There's only 6 countries in the world where you can turn on the tap and have drinkable water, and Australia is one of them. And so we take it, the majority of the Australian population take it for granted that they can get safe water. And so it's not until something goes bad that you get it. We have to value water. We have to make sure that there's enough water to share for everyone, and we have to make sure that that water is absolutely good quality. And it's going to take us 10 to 15 years to get there. If there's one thing fishers can do, it's advocate for healthy rivers with good quality water. Tell the guys in Canberra how important it is and how much you value it. Tell the guys at the state government level, tell your local MPs how much you value it, because you have to remember that it's more than about the good quality water in your area, because your good quality water comes from the next electorate upstream. They have to work together for this solution.
Yeah. So it's not like you said at the start, it's not an isolated problem. It's a whole basin.
Whole of basin problem. Yeah. And you hear this, you quite often hear an argument propagated about, it's about getting water for South Australia. Absolutely it is. They deserve good quality water as much as anyone else does. But when you get into an environment where there's not as much water available, you try and take the water from the area you're at. And the combined effect of doing that across a river means at some point you're going to end up with not enough water. And that's what's happened. And so a big part of the last 20 years has been about recovering enough water for a healthy river, but then recognising that the river's never going to get back to where it was 300 years ago.
Yeah.
So then how do you add additional measures to make sure the water stays healthy? So you've got to get as much as you can and then do the habitat work, do the fish passage work, mitigate thermal pollution, all of those other things that you need to keep the river. Because we're not going to blow up the dams. We're not going to stop people irrigating. We're not going to stop towns from taking water.
Yeah.
So you have to do the best you can with the system you've got.
So what happens now? You've just finished off your inquiry, your panel. Have you made recommendations?
Yep, we've made recommendations. The government are busy working to implement them now. So
is there more urgency around 23 than there was in 18? Do you feel?
Yeah, because the storm clouds are brewing, and that's the thing. So, we've just had 2 perfect storms, and right now we can see them coming in. And so there's already high nutrients. You can't do anything about that really other than try and flush them out. But because there's so high nutrients everywhere, that's bad. There is water around, which is good. So we need to make sure that the environmental holdings of water, there's enough of them that if we see things go bad, we can use it to flush out the system. We need to make sure that we've got equipment ready. So if it does all go bad, if we have a really long stretch of bad, hot weather and it stratifies, get the aerators in the water as quick as you can. Be proactive. And the other thing that they've probably realised that they need to do is set up an emergency response group. So that didn't happen in 2018-19. It did happen last year, but it wasn't implemented as good because it was the first time they did it. So one thing that's come out now is they've said, right, we need an emergency response crew. We need that to be coordinated by a commander. We need to know who all the critical people are to bring in when they need to be brought in so that we can respond better. So I feel that they've done that a lot better. So they've now actually seen this as it qualifies for an emergency response. So
yeah, that's great.
So if it happens again, the police are going to be given special controls where they can bring together a team, including community members and First Nations members, to get on the front foot and stop things from happening. And so now they've got trigger points for when that'll happen.
That's great. And the funny thing is we're going to know how that's going to go because, like you said, we might see one very soon. Yep. And time to put it all in action. You know, we can't keep hiding behind, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. So I think everyone will be waiting to see what actually happens in 24 maybe, or the end of 23.
Yep.
Interesting time. It's rare you can sit down with someone that says there's going to be a fish kill. And you're like, okay. Yeah.
If we get through to next year and there hasn't been a fish kill this year, just by seeing what's there, I'll be really surprised. Will have either have meant that we ended up with better conditions than we did now, or that the emergency response approach worked and we avoided a fish kill. And either of those would be a good outcome.
There you go. Hey, to finish up, I asked the same question to all our guests. Are you optimistic about the future of the basin? Is Lee someone that is an optimist or a pessimist?
Oh, you got to be optimistic, don't you? Because having been through, and I'm laughing now, but it's a very nervous laugh. I mean, having been through these two very big fish kill events over the last few years, you would have to say that's the low point of river management. And if you can't learn something from the lowest point of river management, you're never going to learn anything. And seeing the recommendations start to be adopted, seeing the community so passionate about it, and seeing the cities and understand regional issues more than they ever have before is a reason to be positive. I wouldn't expect to be able to go out and see the fishing the best it's ever been within the next few years, but certainly it's going to get better and it's going to be good for anglers in the long term.
It's good to hear. Look, we've covered a lot there. I think there's a lot to unpack. You know, we've covered words like blackwater, hydrology, stratification, the effects of nutrients and algae and bacteria. We've looked at why Menindee is such a hot spot and I guess what is a perfect storm, both in 11, 18 and 23 and potentially 24, maybe even another one this year. For anyone listening, I hope you've got enough information now to be able to go down to the local cafe or the local pub and be able to explain to someone, you know, what happens when we get a fish kill here in Australia, and also be able to follow the story both in the media and on websites like Ozfish and whatnot, and understand when you see something being implemented, you know why. You know, why is there bubble plumes? Why is there aerators? You know, why is there fish ladders being built? All those things. So that's the goal of a podcast like this. Thank you so much for your time. Awesome. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully it's not the last. I'm sure there's another topic we can dive into. Hopefully it's not about...
Let's talk about a fun, happy topic.
Exactly. Maybe we should schedule one in 12 months' time, knowing your calendar. But until then, it's been fantastic. There's plenty of episodes on Ozcast. This rounds out season 1. We've got 12 there in the bank, and there's another 12 coming in 24. Until next time, Lee.
Thank you.
Cheers. This episode of Ozcast is proudly supported by the Australian Government through the CRC program and BCF Boating Camping Fishing.